In early February 2024, an interview with Karlson and Midge was aired.
My name is Carlson on the roof. You like it?
These are not characters from Astrid Lindgren's fairy tale, but an American alleged journalist and war criminal, Russian President Putin. Putin didn't answer Karlson's question about why he invaded Ukraine, but decided to discuss history again.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
In fact, 30 seconds turned into more than 30 minutes of lies and nonsense. But we were not disgusted to watch and fact-check it to expose all the lies. We managed to do it in just almost 20 minutes, so let's roll.
The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood, and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862, when the townspeople of Novgorod invited a Varangian prince, Rurik, from Scandinavia to reign.
He had just started, and a bunch of lies at once. Of course, there couldn't have been a Russian state at that time. The country with that name appeared almost 900 years later. Moreover, archaeology proves that there was no Novgorod in 862. The first settlements appeared there only 100 years later. The legend of Prince Rurik and Novgorod appeared much later in Kievan Chronicles, and it is nothing more than literature. Genuine historical sources speak of a different state and a different first prince, Igor, in the city of Kiev.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
Substitution of concepts. The country of that time was called Rus, not Russia, and it had one capital city, Kiev.
The next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988. This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity. From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen.
Again, a substitution of concepts. The country wasn't called Russia, but Rus, with its capital in Kiev. The territories where Muscovite statehood would later be formed had nothing to do with Rus at that time.
And the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties, one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince.
False. There was indeed one official language for almost the entire Slavic world, Old Slavonic, created in Byzantium by Cyril and Methodius. However, people on the territory of Kievan Rus naturally spoke different languages. The Slavic dialects of these lands later began to form three languages: Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian, and Old Novgorodan.
His successors, namely Batu Khan, came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty.
That's a lie. Everything was exactly the opposite. The westernmost Ruthenian lands, Galicia and Volhynia, retained their sovereignty and were called the Kingdom of Rus. The central Ukrainian territories, along with Belarus, later became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus and Žemaičia. The future Muscovy itself became completely dependent on the Golden Horde. By the way, exactly then, in the 13th century, the Moscow Principality was created by order of Khan Mengu Timur. How much did it retain its sovereignty? Let's listen to the Russian historian Lev Gumilev. How independent northeastern Rus felt is evident from the fact that in 1248 the rightful heir to the Grand Duchy of Vladimir, Sviatoslav Vsevolodovich, brother of the deceased Yaroslav who was confirmed to the throne by Batu, was expelled by Mikhail of Tver after reigning for less than a year. He ended his days in the Horde, seeking justice in vain. Lev Gumilev, Ancient Rus and the Great Steppe.
They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty. And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow.
He messed it all. According to Putin, this is the second time that Russian statehood has been formed, and this time it's a bit more like the truth. Yes, it was after the collapse of the Golden Horde in the 15th century that Muscovy was formed. The Moscow Principality began by conquering neighboring states, Tver and Ryazan principalities, the Tatars Kazan, Astrakhan and Siberian Khanates, and the already mentioned Republic of Novgorod. And in the latter, Moscow committed a real genocide. That's why there are no old Novgorodian people and language anymore. Putin doesn't forget about Ukraine, whose lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 16th and 17th centuries.
During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population. They introduced their language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians, that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians.
The word Ukraine, referring to Ukrainian lands, first appears in a chronicle in the 12th century. In 1500, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, in a letter to the Crimean Khan, referred to Kyiv, Volyn and Podillia as our Ukraine. That is, the term Ukraine covers a large territory that extends to almost all of present-day Ukrainian state. In other words, we are not talking about any outskirts, but about the whole country. At the same time, the toponym Rus is used to refer to Ukrainian lands. The term Rus is rarely used to refer to the territories of present-day Russia. In the 17th century, the place named Ukraine was already present on maps, the same ones that Putin and his subordinates scrutinized not so long ago and didn't notice Ukraine. There is no Ukraine there. We know that these lands were simply part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and asked to be part of the Moscow Kingdom, and that was it. The map that Putin was shown by his henchman is a part of an atlas of Eastern Europe. It was created in 1674 by cartographer Guillaume Sanson. Its title reads, Europe divided according to the extent of its principal states, divided into its principal provinces. Ukraine is present on this map. I did poorly at university because I drank a lot of beer. Central Ukraine, right bank and left bank, is designated as the land of the Cossacks, while Western Ukraine is called Black Rus, Russie Noire. But what is most interesting is that Putin's subordinate deceived him twice. And the great Russian state. Because on this map, Ukraine is present, while Russia is not. Why? Because at that time, the country with that name simply didn't exist. On maps, the future Russia was called Muscovy or Tartary. This is where Putin comes to one of the decisive moments in history. The Zaporozhian army, led by Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, rebelled against Poland and established a military democracy, the Hetmanate on Ukrainian territory.
They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression of Ukraine.
It was in the 13th century.
What is he talking about? Why 13th century? This is the 17th century, 400 years later.
When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
Actually, it is difficult to comment on this nonsense. Yes, Khmelnytsky wrote letters to the Tsar of Moscow, the King of Sweden, the King of Poland, the Prince of Transylvania and the Tatar Khan, and to the Turkish Sultan. Basically, as head of state, he was actively engaged in diplomatic correspondence. For example, during the war with Poland, he signed an agreement with the Muscovy, where he recognized the supremacy of the Tsar in exchange for military assistance and respect for Cossacks' rights and privileges. The promises were not fulfilled. In fact, Putin himself admits this.
And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed. And these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland.
Putin messed up the years. Again, the Andrusovo peace treaty between Poland and Muscovy was signed in 1667, but this is not the point. Realizing that they had been deceived, the Cossacks themselves began negotiations with Poland. And Moscow, just like now, started a hybrid war and then a full-scale invasion against Ukraine. However, it suffered a heavy defeat near Konotop. Unfortunately, disagreements between the Cossacks didn't allow this success to be consolidated, and the new hetman had signed an agreement with the Kremlin. Again.
Under the rule of Catherine the Great,
wow, how he jumped ahead for more than 100 years! And a lot of interesting things have happened during this time. For example, there were several Moscow-Ukrainian wars. The most famous one was when Hetman Mazepa of Ukraine united with King Charles XII of Sweden against Tsar Peter of Moscow. But they lost. Peter retaliated by organizing a genocide against civilians in Ukraine. The Cossacks' capital of Baturin was massacred on his orders, with an estimated 15,000 people killed. After that, Peter renamed his state, stealing the ancient name of Ukraine. Only then, Muscovy became Russia. And during this time, in violation of all agreements, Muscovy was constantly reducing Ukrainian independence, using so-called salami slicing tactics.
Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west.
This is a complete lie. Again, the Black Sea region, the Azov Sea region and Crimea have never been not only Russian in the sense of Muscovy, they didn't even belong to Rus. The Golden Horde was here, and then the Crimean Khanate. In the 18th century, a small Cossack state existed on these lands under the protectorate of the Crimean Khan, the so-called Han's Ukraine. But yes, the Russian Empire under Catherine captured all of these territories with the help of Cossacks, and then Russians destroyed the remnants of Ukrainian autonomous statehood.
This all lasted until the revolution.
What was going on? And where did he jump again for almost 100 years? In the mid-19th century, the Ukrainian national movement awakened on the wave of Romanticism. Its leaders, including the poet Taras Shevchenko, were imprisoned by the Russian authorities and exiled to distant regions of the empire. The Ukrainian language was banned in education, culture, and even public speaking. The Ukrainian movement, meanwhile, continued in another region, Galicia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Before World War I, Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization.
Unfortunately for Ukraine, the Austrian General Staff didn't engage in any Ukrainization before the First World War. But after the outbreak of the war, it allowed Ukrainians, like other nations in Austria-Hungary, to create their own small military unit, the Siege Rifleman Legion. Nevertheless, the Russian Empire, like the Austrian Empire, didn't survive the First World War. A revolution broke out there, and as a result, the Tsar abdicated. Then the Bolshevik coup took place, and the country collapsed. Most of the enslaved peoples, including Ukrainians, created their own statehood. This is how the Ukrainian People's Republic was born.
After the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood, and the civil war began, including the hostilities with Poland.
Civil war with Ukraine? A civil war with Poland? He messed all up again. The civil war was within Russia, between the Bolsheviks and the monarchists. War against Ukraine and Poland was a Russian aggression.
In 1921, peace with Poland was proclaimed, and under that treaty, the right bank of Dnieper River once again was given back to Poland.
Indeed, central, eastern and southern Ukraine was invaded by the Russian army as a result of the war, which Ukraine lost at that time.
In 1922, when the USSR was being established, the Bolsheviks started building the USSR and established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before.
Right.
And again, for some unknown reasons, he transferred to that newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some of the lands together with people living there, even though those lands had never been called Ukraine, and yet they were made part of that Soviet Republic of Ukraine. Those lands included the Black Sea region, which was received under Catherine the Great, and which had no historical connection with Ukraine whatsoever.
He lies, lies, lies. The first lie is that the Bolsheviks created Ukraine. No, Ukraine was created by Ukrainians in 1917, and they managed to elect a parliament, the Central Rada, and the government. Bolshevik Russia started a war against Ukraine twice and eventually captured it. But in order to stop the resistance, it was forced to agree to the existence of Ukrainian statehood, at least alleged one, in the form of Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Point 2. Borders. They were formed on the basis of the Ukrainian majority inhabiting the territory. The data was taken from the results of the Russian census of 1897. However, in the course of negotiations with the Provisional Government of Russia, the border was drawn along the boundaries of the former provinces. That is why a large number of Ukrainians found themselves outside Ukraine, in Russia. This was shown in the next Soviet census of 1926. Then Putin talks about the Second World War, and the whole world is shocked, or no one is surprised anymore.
It went too far, pushing Hitler to start World War II by attacking them. Why was it Poland against whom the war started on 1st September 1939? Poland turned out to be uncompromising, and Hitler had nothing to do but start implementing his plans with Poland.
What? It turns out that the aggressor is not to blame, but the victim? Did Poland force Hitler to start the war because it didn't want to give up its land in parts? Of course, from Putin's point of view, it was Ukraine that forced him to start the Third World War. Oh, just a war for now. Putin forgot to say that Hitler didn't attack Poland alone. While Nazis invaded from the west, the Soviet Union attacked it from the east. Stalin previously conspired with Hitler about it while making a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Oh no, actually, Putin mentioned that.
Thus, Russia, which was then named as USSR, regained its historical lands.
Which historical territories? Russia has never owned Galicia except for a brief occupation in 1914-15. Is everything that has ever been captured by Russia already considered its historical territory?
After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we call World War II, all those territories were ultimately enshrined as belonging to Russia, to the USSR.
This is again a lie and a substitution of concepts. Galicia and Volhynia were not assigned to Russia. It became the territory of the Ukrainian SSR, which wasn't just a part of the USSR, but a founding member of the UN and a signatory to the post-war peace treaties, at least formally.
After the World War II, Ukraine received, in addition to the lands that had belonged to Poland before the war, part of the lands that had previously belonged to Hungary and Romania.
And Russia got a part of the German ones. Königsberg became Kaliningrad. Only unlike Königsberg, where there were no Russians, Ukraine got territories where the majority of the population was Ukrainian. But besides Putin's manipulation, there is an interesting question Carlson asks without a tone of irony.
Do you believe Hungary has a right to take its land back from Ukraine and that other nations have a right to go back to their 1654 borders?
It's a bad comparison, but it's like asking an American if he wants the US to return to the borders of 1835. That is, before the annexation of Texas and the conquest of California from Mexico. And Karlson also asks Putin if he has offered Orban to take back Transcarpathia. It would be like asking him if he has offered the British to take back the United States, because it was once a British colony.
We have not even had any conversation on that, but I actually know for sure that Hungarians who live there wanted to get back to their historical land.
This is a lie and manipulation. Putin cannot know for certain what the Hungarians want. He also forgot to add that Hungarians make up just 10% of the region's population. Well, let's move on. Somewhere in the middle of the 2-hour interview, Carlson asks the Midge what denazification is. And then Putin got carried away. He starts talking about the innate hatred of Ukrainians toward Poles because of what they did 300 years ago.
When World War II broke out, part of this extremely nationalist elite collaborated with Hitler, believing that he would bring them freedom.
By the way, this is almost true, but manipulated, of course. In 1939-41, representatives of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, had contacts with some Third Reich officials, hoping to get help in gaining independence. 2 special operations battalions were created from among the OUN members. However, the cooperation ended very quickly when the OUN proclaimed the restoration of Ukrainian statehood in June 1941. Soon afterwards, the Third Reich began brutal repressions against the leadership and ordinary members of the Ukrainian nationalist organization.
The German troops, even the SS troops, made Hitler's collaborators do the dirtiest work of exterminating the Polish and Jewish population.
This is a lie and manipulation again. Firstly, as already mentioned, the OUN's cooperation with the Third Reich ended in the summer of 1941, after which the organization went underground and fought the Nazis for some time. Yes, collaborationist units were formed from among Ukrainians. Also, this is a completely different story. The Ukrainian-Polish conflict that erupted in Volyn in 1943 had nothing to do with collaboration with the Nazis.
This was led by the persons who are well known: Bandera, Shushkevich.
Shushkevich was the president of Belarus in the early 90s. Putin was probably referring to the leader of the Ukrainian insurgent army, Roman Shushkevich. But let's take one step at a time. So the leader of the OUN, Stepan Bandera, couldn't commit crimes during the Second World War. In 1941, the Germans imprisoned him in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he was kept until the end of the war. Two of his brothers were killed by the Nazis. Roman Shuhevich, as an officer of the German battalion, remained on duty until the end of 1942. After that, Nazis tried to arrest him, but he managed to escape. In 1943, Roman became the head of the newly created Ukrainian insurgent army, which began fighting the Nazis in occupied Ukraine. Shuhevich perished in 1950 in combat with NKVD troops, and Bandera was killed by KGB agent in 1959 by the orders of the USSR leadership.
These people have been made into national heroes in Ukraine.
Every country has the right to define its own national heroes. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible, the author of the genocide against people of Novgorod, and Alexander Suvorov, the perpetrator of the genocide against the Cherkess and Nogai peoples, are praised as heroes. But this is not the case. With this interview with pseudo-historical nonsense, Putin once again made it clear that he and Russia are not going to give Ukraine the right to define its heroes or simply exist. Nothing at all.